scripture this morning, taken from Acts chapter 13, verse 22. And when he had removed him, he raised up David to be their king, of whom he testified and said, I have found in David, the son of Jesse, a man after my heart, who will do all my will.
Good morning. If you don't know, we're doing a series about the heroes of our faith, looking into the Old Testament and looking at individuals that we oftentimes only talk about when it comes to children's Bible classes. So if we're all at the level of a child in a Bible class, then we're all prepared for this series, right? We talked about the idea of the faith of Abraham, being able to look at Abraham being called to leave the Ur of Chaldees from Haran and to go into a place where he didn't know where he was going, looking for a city whose designer and builder was God. He eventually was blessed to be able to be the father of many nations, which Abraham means literally. And he was someone that we can emulate by being able to step out in faith outside of our so-called comfort zone to do things that are sometimes scary or difficult to be able to be the kind of person God needs us to be in life to bring about his will. We talked about Moses, and I said it very politely last week. I called it the strong will of Moses. And if you've ever been called a strong-willed child before, you know how polite that is. He's hard-headed, just like some of us sometimes can be. He was someone that tried to redeem the people without God backing him, and he failed. Then he was someone who's able to stand in between the wrath of God and the people that he was the mediator for, and eventually accepted the consequences of his own failure by not being allowed into the land of Canaan. And today, I had an outline prepared. And then I started to do the PowerPoint for the outline that I had prepared. And we would be here for an hour. Not a joke. It was like, okay, we're going to do the entirety of David versus Goliath and the entirety of David and Bathsheba, and then the end of his life, David releasing the crown to his son and preparing his son for the future. We're going to do all of that in 23 and a half minutes. Problem with that is I can't do that in 23 and a half minutes and do it justice. So what I decided to do is we're talking about David at least twice, if not three times, coming up, because we have a lot of information about the life of David, and we even have some insight into his mindset, his emotional state from reading the Psalms. So there's just so much about the life of David that we have access to. And he's such a great example for us to emulate and to be like, because as we read in our verse, he is a man after God's own heart who would do God's will. He was the right person in that king role for the people of Israel. But what I want to do today is talk about David and this giant named Goliath. Now, I'm sure many of us have heard that story before, but what I want to do is, for my own purposes, slow down and take our time and not just rush it. So let's turn to 1 Samuel chapter 17 to set the stage for what we find in this particular chapter about the not yet king boy named David. Now, I was, I think, in my senior year of high school when the first Iron Man movie was in theaters. And I just so happened to work at a movie theater that I helped manage. And so I think every night for like 3 or 4 months, we'd close up the concessions and close up the front of house, and then all of us would just turn on Iron Man at like 1 in the morning and just watch that movie over and over and over and over again. And I had no idea how big this Marvel Cinematic Universe would end up being. It's a conglomerate. It's huge. They make billions of dollars off these movies. But what's interesting to me is not just how cool Iron Man is, which we can all agree he's the coolest one. Luke back there, whenever he gets bored, hey, Iron Man? I'm like, okay, we can watch Iron Man. Sure, Iron Man 1. Here we go. But the stories of these heroes the things that they do, although they use technology and cell phones and the internet and all these fanciful things that we have around us today in a world of technology, the stories that they try to capture are timeless stories. They're not new by any stretch of any imagination. We've had these stories forever. And one of the greatest ones, the one that gets my Marvel Cinematic Universe brain fired up, is the life of David. There are just snapshots of moments of him just doing superhero stuff, which I think is just so cool. So I'm going to not nerd out on you too much, but when we look at this, just take in what's being said and how great this young shepherd boy David must have been emulated for generations because of this specific story. So let's go to 1 Samuel 17. Let's begin reading in verse 20. I broke it up so you can actually read it on the screens. If you can't read that, please turn there in your Bibles to follow along. So we're looking at verses 20 through 24 to begin the narrative. At this time, to kind of give you some prep, we have the Israelites with their king named Saul on one side of this camp. And then you have the great Philistine enemy on the other side. And instead of just the Israelites and their army and the Philistines and their army just going for open combat, what they decided to do was to have a combat by champion. Right? So you send forth your strongest, your biggest, your most steroided out guy you could possibly get, and you've got this giant named Goliath on the Philistine side. He's the enemy, right? And then you have Saul, who's the king, who knows about God and communicates to him through visions and through the prophets that were there. He should have been able to see, it's not about how big our guy is. It's about God giving us the victory. But he was just stumped. He was there in fear and wasn't sending anything out. Goliath is there just egging on the Israelites to send forth someone to fight him, and they wouldn't. And so you have Jesse, who's the father of David, and his sons are in the army. So the young shepherd boy, David, goes to check on his brothers in the army. So here we are, 1 Samuel 17, verse 20. David rose early in the morning and left the sheep that he was watching with a keeper, took the provisions, and went, as Jesse had commanded him. And he came to the encampment as the host was going out to the battle line, shouting the war cry. And Israel and the Philistines drew up for battle, army against army. And David left the things in charge of the keeper of the baggage and ran to the ranks and went and greeted his brothers. And as you might imagine, the younger brother coming to visit the soldiers now, they're not thinking too kindly of the young little kid brother running up and seeing how they're doing, right? As he talked with them, behold, the champion, the Philistine of Gath, Goliath by name, came up out of the ranks of the Philistines and spoke the same words as before. Send somebody out, your God must not be strong enough, etc. David heard him. All the men of Israel, when they saw the man, they fled from him and were much afraid. I mean, as I'm sure I would be if I saw a giant coming out to fight me. Yeah, you back off a little bit. Verse 25. And the men of Israel said, have you seen this man who has come up? Surely he has come up to defy Israel. And the king will enrich the man who kills him with great riches and will give him his daughter and make his father's house free in Israel, meaning you are tax exempt for life. How afraid was King Saul to go and fight Goliath? He's like, hey, I will make you wealthy. I'll give you my own daughter to be your wife, and you are tax exempt for life, you and your father's house. He did not want to go and fight Goliath, right? Let's keep reading. David stood by the men, said to the men who stood by him, what shall be done for the man who kills the Philistine and takes away the reproach from Israel? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God? And the people answered him in the same way, so it shall be done for the man who kills him. So he's just curious, hey, whoever defeats Goliath, what do you get for that? Because this guy doesn't know who God is. Verse 28, now the older brothers, hearing their kid, shepherd boy brothers, like, hey, if we fight him, what do we get? Eliab, his older brother, heard him when they spoke to the men, and Eliab's anger was kindled against David, and he said, why have you come down? And with whom have you left those few sheep in the wilderness? I know your presumption and the evil of your heart, because you've come down to see the battle. So you have the older brother here in the army saying, I know why my kid brother is here. He just wants to see someone die. That's all he wants to do. Get some action, get some excitement, leave the boring sheep in the middle of nowhere and see this combat. And David said, what have I done now? Was it not but a word? He turned away from him towards another and spoke in the same way. And the people answered him again as before. So he's still curious. Hey, whoever wins this, what do we get? What's the prize for this? When the words that David spoke were heard, they repeated them before Saul, the king, and he sent for him. Apparently, no one had been curious enough to repeatedly ask, what do we get if we fight him? What do I get if I fight him? Because no one had stepped up and said, I'll be the one to go and die against this giant on the battlefield. So now they have this young, probably 15, 16-year-old shepherd boy who's curious about this combat situation, and that's enough to pique the interest of the king of the nation to say, are you willing to go and fight this guy? Because if you are, here's what you get if you happen to live, right? Let's keep reading. Verse 32. And David said to Saul, let no man's heart fail because of him. Your servant will go and fight with the Philistine. Saul said to David, you're not able to go against this Philistine to fight with him because you're just a kid. Well, technically it says you are but a youth, but you know what he means. You're just a kid. And he has been a man of war since he was a kid. But David said to Saul, your servant used to keep sheep for his father. And when there came a lion or a bear, and they took a lamb from the flock, I went after him, struck him, and delivered it out of his mouth. Now we'll pause right there for a second. I'm not calling David, as a 16-year-old kid, a liar. But I am saying, if you were a 16-year-old kid and you were watching a couple of sheep in the middle of nowhere, and a lion or a bear took one of those sheep, what would your thought be? Well, I better go back and get him. Dad's going to be mad. Or are you going to say, well, we lost one. Stuff happens. I mean, it's a bear, you know? But what does David say about it? If he arose against me, I caught him by his beard, as we all know bears and lions have. Struck him and killed him. With your bare hands, you killed a bear and a lion. All right. Your servant has struck down both lions, plural, and bears, plural. Again, I'm sure it's the truth, but it just sounds like one of those stories, right? And this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them. Well, you gotta love the gumption. I'm not sure what gumption is, but he's got it, right? Because, why? He has defied the armies of the living God. And David said, the Lord who delivered me from the paw of the lion and from the paw of the bear will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine. And the king said, go, and the Lord be with you. Good luck, kid. You got this. This is already an incredible scene. Now, because we have the Holy Spirit inspiring the author here, we know that the words here are accurate and they are true. But it's just so out of this world. This is a movie script, is it not? I mean, this is one little guy against a giant. And if you already know the conclusion to the story, you know who wins. If you don't, I'm not going to spoil it for you yet. But we're about to get there. Verse 38. See how the text gets smaller and smaller the further we go? Sorry. This is supposed to be point 1, by the way. This is just point 1 of my original outline, so you're welcome. Okay, verse 38. Then Saul clothed David with his armor. He put a helmet of bronze on his head and clothed him with a coat of mail, and David strapped his sword over his armor. So he's got the armor of the King Saul here. Probably good armor, but he's a 16-year-old kid, right? He tried in vain to go because he had not tested them. Then David said to Saul, I can't go with these because I've not tested them. I don't train in this. I don't wear this often. So David took him off. He then took his staff in his hand, and he chose 5 smooth stones from the brook and put them in his shepherd's pouch. His sling was in his hand, and he approached the Philistine. Now, let me just pause here and give you some inside information if you don't know already. If you already know the situation here, he's not going to use all 5 stones, right? Because that would be less heroic, I suppose. Why did he choose 5? Well, we're not given a verse that says why he chose 5, but we do learn in a passage later on, you've got big boy Goliath out there on the battlefield, and he's got 4 younger brothers who are also Nephilim. They're also giants. Now, I would love to imagine that David looked out on that battlefield, saw Goliath, and then saw 4 more giants back there, and he's like, if I kill this guy, the other 4 are going to come running out to take my life. Let me just take 5 just in case that happens. Again, no verse for it, but let me imagine just for a moment. It makes it a little bit cooler if I do. Okay. Took 5 smooth stones and went out to approach the Philistine. And the Philistine moved forward and came near to David with his shield bearer in front of him. So not only is Goliath there, but he has the guy whose job it is to just carry his shield. It's a pretty good gig, right? He came near to David, shield bearer in front of him. When the Philistine looked and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth, ruddy and handsome in appearance. I don't know why we need to know that, God, but I mean, you're just giving us some information. He's a good-looking young boy. That's what he is, all right? This is the Tony Stark of his universe out there. Good-looking guy. He's even the Thor. If you think Thor is better looking, pick whoever you think the best Marvel character is. That's what David looked like. Okay? All right, same page. And the Philistine said to David, am I a dog that you come to me with sticks? The Philistine cursed David by his gods. The Philistine said to David, come to me, I will give your flesh to the birds of the air and the beasts of the fields. You have a combat-approved giant saying, I'm going to kill this kid. That's the best one you've got to send out against me. And David might have been afraid, but it doesn't seem like it, because verse 45 says this. David said to the Philistine, you come to me with a sword and with a spear and with a javelin. Here's the moment. Y'all ready? Here's goosebumps. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied. This day the Lord will deliver you into my hand. I will strike you down and cut off your head, and I will give the dead bodies of the host of the Philistines this day to the birds of the air, to the wild beasts of the earth, and that all the earth may know that there is a God in Israel, and that all this assembly may know that the Lord saves not with sword and with spear, because the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you into our hand. And he drops the microphone that he was no doubt holding. I mean, it's hard not to react like a 13-year-old boy who just saw an epic action scene. This is in the Bible, guys. This boring old book. This story's in there. I wonder what happens. Verse 48. When the Philistine arose, he came and drew near to meet David. David ran quickly towards the battle line to meet the Philistine. David put his hand in his bag, took out a stone, he slung it, and he struck the Philistine on or in the forehead. Hit him right between the eyes. Pretty good aim, right? The stone sank into his forehead. It broke his skull and went into brain matter, guys. It's a strong 16-year-old, right? He fell on his face to the ground. So, David prevailed over the Philistine and killed him. Now, here's a part where, if you're squeamish, you can just ignore me for the next 30 seconds. But if you were at one time a 13-year-old boy, this is the coolest part. Okay, here we go. There was no sword in the hand of David. David ran, stood over the Philistine, took his sword, drew it out of its sheath, killed him, and cut off his head with it. I'm pretty sure it was quiet after that. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, what'd they do? Retreat! And they all ran. Now, again, this is a story, this is a narrative, it's an account of what took place. But there are some lessons that are very important, that are actually timely for all of us to take from this lesson. The lesson is not go kill giants and take their swords and cut their heads off. That's a bit overkill, right? But there is something to be said about what we learn from this young, naive youth. His trust and confidence in God that was an inspiration not just to his generation, but to us as well. Here are some lessons for you to consider. This is just a couple. From verses 20 and 32 of our text, everyone else was terrified. They were just stopped because of fear. When he saw what was going on, he was courageous. Now, he no doubt wasn't just putting on a show of saying, I'm not scared. In spite of the fear of what was facing him, he was courageous and he showed people the way. In this generation, in this congregation, we need people who see the scary thing, and then despite it, they are still courageous. Verses 34 through 37, he is able to trust and have faith in God based on past experiences. He saw the lion, killed it, took it by the beard, if you will, smacked it in the face and got that lamb back, right? He saw the bear, grabbed him by the beard, punched him in the head, killed him, apparently, grabbed that sheep, and he goes, if you know what, if God has seen me through those experiences, he will see me through this one too. Now, folks, I don't know your world, I don't know your struggles, I don't know your past experiences, but I know enough to know that many of you have gone through things in your life, or may be going through things in your life right now, where God is going to see you through it. You can have faith, trust, confidence that God will be with you with whatever the future throws your way. We need you to be through those experiences and to show us the way. Verse 40, preparation for unforeseen outcomes. That's him grabbing 5 stones instead of just one. What if he missed? It'd be a different story, right? He's planning for possible outcomes. The ability to have the wisdom to know what is possible in the future and to plan for those possibilities. Verses 45 through 47. The Philistine was cursing David and Israel by his gods. When David came out, he had some smack talk, didn't he? But it wasn't based on his own strength, his own experiences. It was based on who his God was. And folks, if you don't know already, the same God that delivered David, the head of Goliath, is the same God that you and I have. And then finally, verses 52 and all the following text, his so-called enthusiasm, you might say, was contagious. When the Philistines booked it for a retreat, then the army of Israel said, now's our time. And they went and they captured and killed the rest of the army. Because David was the one to step forward, to be the man that God needed him to be in that moment, to show people who God was, that encouraged everyone else to follow in his footsteps. We need people in this world, in this congregation, who are willing to be ones to step up and lead all of us down that path towards God. So are there any lessons to learn from the life of David? Yes. That's just point 1 of 3. Next week, Lord willing, we'll talk about, although David was the high water mark for being a faithful leader in Israel, he was flawed because he's just like you and just like me. But the way he deals with his own personal sinful failure shows us why he is a man after God's own heart. There's so much to learn from the Bible. There's so much in this book that just shows us who we could be if we get to know God the way that David knew God. If anyone has a need this morning, if you have a Goliath in your life and you're afraid and you're not sure what to do, let us rally to be with you during this time of need. Whatever giant you're facing, we're here for you. You can come forward and talk to me for a moment. Talk to one of our elders at the door if it's a more private matter. If you have a need at all, please respond now as we stand and we sing.